All right, folks, I thought I would try to give you a little discussion here on the Cordova chapter, Invention, Ethos, and New Media in the Rhetoric Classroom. I was reading the Nuggets, and a couple of you mentioned this one seemed pretty dense in terms of theory, and there's quite a bit of theoreticians mentioned in here. I sort of lost track after a while. So he's definitely assuming a pretty broad familiarity with some really PhD level scholarship, but I think some of the basic nuggets from his chapters still be useful, even if you don't necessarily want to go as deep as he does into the theory of all this. So I've broken it down here basically into five or 4 points. One is Gunther Kress's idea, and this is a pretty old idea at this point, that we can't simply focus on language in a composition course, whether written or spoken, that we need some form of what they're calling multimodal literacy, and that's understanding all these new modal forms, but also being able to produce them, and also being able to adapt. As all these new tools come out. So that's all. I think we could pretty much all agree with this idea. There's a question of you don't want to go so far down this multimodal road, and I think this author Cordova said something along those lines too, right? We don't want to get so far away from writing that we sort of lose sight of the value of that form of literacy, but it's just we can't afford to ignore the multimodal stuff. Writing is still the primary exploratory experience for our students. So I would agree with that. I assume many of you would as well. And then we got this weird concept of ethos, which I was just playing somebody's PowerPoint game, and they had this, sort of Aristotelian ethos, pathos, and logos is kind of the theme of the game, and so this kind of fresh on my mind. But we always think of ethos as being credibility, your level of expertise, the respect people have for you as a speaker, and so on. But he's got a completely different view of it. He's gone back to some other, I think it was Michael Hyde's view. That ethos should be thought of as a dwelling place where different life worlds can flourish. Quite a different understanding of ethos, and it's probably what stumped a lot of people. I know it really threw me for a loop. But I sort of tried to sum up here some of these passages about if you think about how specific discourses invite or move specific audiences, sort of create a verbal environment, if you will, where people can deliberate with each other, converse with each other, get to know things, and sort of in that, I think they call it different words for it, discourse community is what springs to my mind. Just if you think about a discourse community as a place where people can form ethics and character, so I can sort of approach the concept that way, but it's still pretty difficult for me. And then he talks about how we can break down multimodal literacy into these areas: fragmentation, articulation, circulation, convergence, and interface. We'll talk about those here in a second. And then he ties all this up, or he claims that this storyboard assignment he's come up with is a practical way to address many of these concerns. So quite a bit packed into this chapter. I think if I was one of his peer reviewers, I would have told him to maybe save some of the material for another article instead of trying to put it all into one. But we'll see what we can do with it. So first off, this question of why not just focus on language? I know there's a lot of compositionists out there, and they say, and I've said this too, if all quote unquote you teach students in your 191 class is how to write effective essays, I mean, that's a heck of an accomplishment just in and of itself, right? I mean, it's hard enough. It's plenty of enough challenge for anybody. Why in the world do we feel like we also need to be teaching all of these other skills like storyboarding or video production or whatever it is? Why try to pack all this in? And the argument for including those other activities is usually taken from somebody like Castells here. I've seen him mentioned many, many, many times. He's a foundational text at this point. But he's got some books about the network society or the information society, informationalism, and how the fact that everybody's on networks using the internet and mobile devices and all this stuff, that's actually a pretty fundamental change to our culture and society. There's a quote here I like. So, the diffusion of networking logic substantially modifies the operation and outcomes in production, experience, power, and culture. So if you really appreciate that networking logic, or the internet basically, has had this much of an impact, and it's just had this fundamental of a effect on culture, then it does seem really important to factor that in. And even if you're only able to sort of minimally do work like this in 191, that might be the only place a lot of students get this stuff, right? So he talks here about a multiliteracy pedagogy should challenge the gravitational pull of the multimedia industry. It's kind of interesting that they use the term multimedia there. It's kind of, I would say, probably new media or digital media. But anyway, that industry exerts towards the consumption of technical wizardry, the spectacular, and the dispersal of the critical faculties of the subject to establish nourishing relationships. And ties that in with this other idea that in this network society, individuals consume a world fabricated by others rather than producing one of their own. So again, I'm not really sure what to make of some of these claims here. I don't really think we live in a society where the world is fabricated by others rather than us. I don't know, where's the point in history where people didn't consume stories that were already out there, right? I'm not quite sure what this point they're trying to make here, but I can sort of glean from this the idea, I suppose, that these spectacular new forms of cultural production, all the amazing stuff happening in the movies and in games and apps, I guess, and all of these, and what they call here multimedia projects. So there does seem to be a pretty big rift in what you're consuming versus what you can realistically expect to produce yourself. Just a quick example. So you could have students read short stories, and there's a pretty good idea that the students reading the short stories might think, I could write a short story. This is what, I might not write the best short story, but I could write a short story, and it would look just like these other short stories. Maybe if you got, it's kind of believable that you could get to a point where you could write a short story that wouldn't look cheap or poorly built, right? Whereas if you think about making a video game like World of Warcraft, for example, you would need all kinds of skills. It's kind of hard to compete with that, right? The technical wizardry, it's just, so I sort of think that's kind of where that's sort of where their thinking is with this. Is there kind of this increasing rift between the world that we're presented with versus what we can realistically expect to make and produce on our own. But anyway, I think there's lots of different directions we can go. I want to get your point of view on this. What do you think about these ideas about a network society, and whether a 191 class should just focus on language or go into these multiliteracy domains? Okay, so moving on then, we got these different criteria of multiliteracy. It makes a lot of sense to me, actually. I like the way he's got this broken into these categories. He talks at first about fragmentation, and this is, again, kind of a well-established principle at this point. I usually see it described as intertextuality, the idea that an individual text is not a self-contained world. You read a novel, that novel can't really stand by itself because there's all of these references to all of these other novels, all these other stories, all of this stuff that exists outside the novel. And of course, as a reader, you don't just approach that novel as that was the only one you've ever read. You don't get to be a blank slate. You come with all this stuff that's basically what we call intertextuality. And I guess, though, he thinks that some students might not see it that way. They might think about text as being self-contained or whole. And part of a multiliteracy's pedagogy would be getting them beyond that idea. And he gives an example, I think is a very good example, of memes, those little Facebook memes, as being a good way to think about this concept. And it makes a lot of sense. You think about all the ones with the Keanu Reeves, or the sort of as a Morpheus from The Matrix, or Willy Wonka. Those sort of memes, when you look at those and you laugh and you think that's pretty funny. But if you think about all of those different texts the movies, uh, whatever the meme itself is about, maybe something going on in the political realm. But really, though, those memes kind of represent a lot of different kinds of texts that have been sort of woven together temporarily into this meme. And of course, you could take that same meme and use it for lots of different purposes. And so instead of just thinking about that as a unique thing about memes, what I want to do is think that memes are just one case of this, but all texts do it to some extent. So I like that section. They also talk about articulation, which this comes up all the time in cultural studies. I think Stuart Hall does a lot of work in this area, but he's quoting Laclau and Mouffe, pretty well-known theorists. And they're talking about, here, I'll just read this quotation to you, because it's a little bit hard to keep all this mentally there, right? And it says, dominant structures, or they say, dominant structures in political struggles are best viewed not as emerging out of historical necessity, but out of hegemonic articulations that help us frame those same struggles. So political struggles, let's just go with that. Those are not, I guess, it wasn't inevitable that those things would come about, but rather it has to do with the way this hegemony structures discourse, I guess is what you can really come down to saying. And that process is called articulation. So that's remember those fragments we were talking about earlier. So they say articulation is a process where all these fragments, it's a meme or whatever it is, gets combined to form a new fragment. And that in turn can gain social primacy. So again, I think a lot of this is related, getting away from a blank slate, self-contained sort of view. We have all this information flowing around in the network. People are building these memes. These fragments are coming together. Sometimes they spark a lot of activity, a lot of discourse around it, and that's where this. I guess that's how you can change the dominant structures and get involved in these political struggles, right? And you could even change. I guess if these got big enough, right, they could even change the political conversation, right? I guess you could. I don't want to bring too much of the modern politics. It's kind of a big mess, right? But you can certainly think about Twitter. How these little tweets are sort of sparking all of this articulations. And what is a tweet but a little fragment of discourse, right? So we get here to circulation and dissemination, and this is another key principle, right? So you don't want to just think about text as an artifact, as a book, but you also want to think about that book as being part of this. I almost see it kind of as a flow, as a one link in this chain or a web. And what you really want to focus on is this, what they call the discursive economy or the network flow. So again, thinking about Twitter, sometimes people tweet and nobody even reads it, right? It's just kind of a personal thing. Other times, like I just saw, who was it? I think Sulu, what's his name? Is George Takei or Takei? I always forget how to pronounce his name. But he tweeted something about this Trump, and they got picked up by the Huffington Post, and that's sort of become a big news item now. This tweet from Sulu, right? So that's an example of this. I would say that I'll just call him George. George, he's got a great Twitter feed. It's very popular. And I think one of the ways that it's become popular is because he's gotten really good at thinking about how these tweets can be shared by other people. What sort of things people want to share? Do they want to put on their Twitter feeds or put on their Facebook sites? He really seems to have a good understanding of the way Twitter works. And I think that's a very valuable skill for not just for him to have, but for anybody to have. It's really interesting how he can leverage his celebrity from Star Trek to make such a huge impact in the political realm. There's some questions as to how much we could teach this. He talks here about how they're put together with such circulatory potential and mobility in mind. I guess again coming back to the idea of Twitter. People criticize it all the time because you got that 140 character limit or something like that. They think of that as being a bad thing. Like it'd be better if you could have much longer text. But in a way, that's the longer it is, the harder it is for it to interpass and travel through the economy, right? These little bytes or smaller fragments, it's easier for people to read those and share them, I guess, and spread them. And that's by design. Twitter designed it that way, right? So these are all interesting conversations to have. Then we move into convergence or hybridity. I mean, any one of these could have been a whole chapter, right? Henry Jenkins, I'm sure some of you probably read his book, Convergence Culture. It's a great book. Highly recommend that book, actually. He talks a lot in there about old new media colliding. He's got examples like Harry Potter fan fiction and the effects that has on writing education. He talks in there about the Matrix, if memory serves, transmedia, all of these really cool concepts. And I don't think he does this. This author criticizes him. Sounds like it's saying that convergence. I guess he's thinking about if things are converging into something like an iPhone, which he says levels hybridity. Now, if you read Jenkins, at least Jenkins specifically says he doesn't do this. That's not what he means by convergence culture. He calls it the black boxing. Like he says, there's never going to be a point where there'll just be this one box in your house, and that's where everything streams in and out of. Instead of that kind of model, we're going to have more and more devices and platforms. It's going to get more diverse. That's not really what he means by convergence culture. But anyway, the example of an iPhone, I guess, makes a certain amount of sense. You got sort of the wild world of Android apps versus the walled garden of an iPhone app store, where they have very specifically blocked a whole bunch of content to keep people safe, or to maintain a certain vibe, I guess, gated community, whatever you want to call it. And again, not quite sure if I agree with him or even what to make of this argument. But he does fall back on this older notion of hybridity, the post-colonial concept. And again, this is something else we could talk about all day. It's a huge, huge concept in post-colonial studies. There's an article, I think it's Marie-Louise Pratt, something about art in the contact zones. Anyway, this word contact zone is important. So you got these colonies of people, sort of imperial colonies or what have you, and they in between the, I don't want to use the term invaders, but I guess that would work. So you got the people there to colonize this area where there's already people living, and the contact zone of where those two forces come together, and to understand one another, they create these new forms of discourse, or new kinds of writing or communication, I suppose. It's a pretty deep and rich concept, but he kind of wants to compare and contrast that, or set it up as an opposite of a convergence, and that's not quite how I see it. But anyway, moving on. Finally, he talks about interface, and he mentions how the interface is never a neutral mechanism. And I'm surprised he didn't mention Cindy Self. She's got an article called "The Politics of the Interface." It's very famous in computers and writing. And the idea there is that when you create an interface for something like Microsoft Office, you're using all these metaphors like an office and file cabinets and paper clips, and things that kind of representative of, I guess, sort of a white collar world, a business world, and that's that's going to have effects go well beyond just how efficient you can use the system. And it's going to be great for people that are familiar with all those office metaphors. But what about somebody who's no idea, never seen a filing cabinet, or doesn't work with paper clips and all of these sort of office metaphors? Self talks about other possibilities. They could have gone with a kitchen metaphor instead. And like everything would be based around cooking metaphors. Actually, I love that idea. But we tend to think of these interfaces as just being natural, or the obvious. It's obvious why they should be that way, when there's actually this ideological stuff at work. So part of multiliteracy education, I guess, would be teaching people how an interface, and I'll just read this, is a virtual site where people engage in the process of design within the distinct models of the mediated world. It's a mouthful. I think it makes sense to think about something like Adobe Photoshop. And if you think about how Photoshop it's a tool, it's a piece of software, but it's kind of got its own, I want to use the word like vibe, where there's a community of people of professional artists and graphic designers, and they love this tool. They like working on Apples and Macintoshes, and they use Photoshop, and they really speak the language of Photoshop to each other, right? And it wouldn't, you could have another tool out there like I don't even know really what like GIMP. I think is kind of a Photoshop alternative, and the interface is similar in some ways, but that's not really the key thing to be looking at, right? Is you got sort of people that would be okay using GIMP for whatever reason. Maybe the people even have an ideological reason to use GIMP because it's a free open source program, versus the Photoshop people who feel like they've got some professional stake in that program. And yes, it's very expensive, but that's an investment they chose to make. So I kind of almost forget where I'm going with this, but I do like this idea. This is sort of where it's starting to come together for me, this idea of ethos as a dwelling place. Like the ethos of Adobe Photoshop, and seeing it more than just a piece of software, but it's kind of this site where people, professional graphic designers, are using it and engaging in this process, and it's a very distinctive model compared to the way GIMP people might be doing it, or somebody that just uses a Paint or one of these free web-based photo programs. So I don't really know where I was going there, but hopefully that made some kind of sense. Okay, and then wrapping up here, he talks about his assignment, which I know some people said that they didn't really think this assignment passed passed muster, I suppose, but I don't know. So it's a program called Storyboard Quick, and I haven't used it before, but it sounds like it's pretty much exactly what it sounds. You can choose backgrounds, and you've got characters you can put into the scenes and props, and move them around and sort of set it up as though you were making a storyboard for television, I suppose. But the writing comes in because they have to still do a lot of work in text form, like what is going on in this scene, right? What's the dialogue? But they are getting a chance to basically build these dwelling. If you think about the scenes as sort of dwelling places where you got some characters in there, it sort of starts to make some sense. He says he does this to let students craft a comprehensive visual representation of a narrative. And so I guess you could have them read a novel, maybe, or a short story, or just maybe narrate something that happened. So instead of an essay, they're making these storyboards to go with it, and that's giving them some appreciation. I would almost say this is kind of a form of, show, don't tell, right? One of the big challenges, if you've ever tried to write a script for television or for a play, is that, obviously people can't. You have to have something on the stage at all times. You have to have something there happening, something for people to see happening on stage or on screen. That's a very different way of thinking than if you're writing a novel where so much stuff can happen inside characters' minds. It doesn't have to be depicted. You can just tell them. So I think that is a useful project, maybe more so if they're inclined towards going into some kind of video career or games or something. How useful is that if they're not planning to do that? I guess it comes back to this idea if you think of that as a society we're pushing towards this area or this era when everybody will be doing these more visual representations. So I guess I'm sorry if I haven't clarified all this for you. I try my best. I will say this is quite dense in terms of theory. So if you don't feel like you fully grokked it, use a hacker term there, don't sweat it too much, but maybe this is a little brush, a little introduction maybe to some of these theorists that if you go on to a PhD program, you'll undoubtedly come across again. And I'll just end here. I love this ending thought here about how maybe the storyboard project or something similar can promote an understanding of literacy as a stylized performance. And I'm really sort of intrigued by this line, literacy as stylized performance. I think I get where he's going there, but I'd like to hear your thoughts on. So, what do you think this means? Literacy as stylized performance. All right, I think that'll do it. I hope this was useful to you in some way. If you do have questions, I could try my best to answer them. But in any case, I'll see you next time and have fun.